We will be doing a Q&A, so if you have any questions while the panelists are talking, just type it into that Q&A and we'll address those questions at the end. Okay, so up next I'm going to read a statement from the Spokane Democratic Socialists of America. Defunding the police achieves the immediate goals of harm reduction and the provision of additional resources to community services while also serving as an important step toward the abolition of police and the move toward a more just society. We must defund the police in order to achieve several aims. First, we must act immediately to end police violence, including assault, rape, and murder against the working class, especially among people of color, people with disabilities, and transgender people. Second, we must reallocate public funds away from violent, oppressive institutions into social services, including housing, public health, mental health services, childcare, and education that help to create safer, healthier, and more equitable communities. Third, we must move toward police abolition to eliminate a violent, reactionary barrier to working class movements that are aimed at overthrowing racist, capitalist institutions. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Nate, who's going to talk about a brief history of police and the defund and abolish, and then the socialist perspective on policing and the role of the DSA.
Thanks, Quinna, and thank you for everyone who came out today, and especially to the panelists who are here to share a lot of good information and kind of give us some steps to move forward and things to think about as well. One question that I would have everyone to think about during this time is to really think about what it is that the police do, as well as what the public imagination is of what the police do, because I think these are often two very different things. Today, I'm going to approach that question from a historical angle to talk about a very brief history of policing. So I'm not going to do it justice as far as how in-depth the topic can get, but I want to review some kind of basic information about how the socialist left approaches policing. So I'm going to start off with this quote here by Alex Vitale, who wrote a book called The End of Policing. And it's important to understand this definition here, that the development of policing is multi-pronged, but it's centered around what Alex Vitale and many other scholars would call a force that manages the behaviors of people on the losing end of economic and political arrangements. So you can imagine who those groups would be. That includes the working class. It includes racial minorities and religious minorities. It includes basically anyone who doesn't have a direct relationship with the ruling class. The development, I say, is multi-pronged because there are multiple different institutions that helped form what the police look like today. So some obvious ones jump out immediately, and that includes slave patrols early on, which were made entirely to enforce slave codes, to capture people who had escaped slavery, and really morphed into what we see with the violent reactionary Southern police during the long civil rights movement. And continuing to both suppress those movements and terrorize Black communities, even in the wake of emancipation. Another group that we can look at as a foundational piece to modern day policing would be the Texas Rangers and the very early Border Patrol. So these groups operated kind of similarly, enforcing racist laws and territorial grabs against Mexicans and Mexican-American communities along the border, which of course lays the groundwork for the modern day Border Patrol and of course ICE as well. The professionalization of the police starts in the mid 19th century, but really kind of comes to something that looks more recognizable to us in the early 20th century. And these were, professional groups hired by cities or counties or states to essentially manage behavior of people who would be considered deviant to the state. And this includes a wide group of people, basically this same definition. So this would include poor people, homeless and transient people, through vagrancy laws and things like that, immigrants, union workers, socialists, communists, LGBTQ people, anti-war activists, as well as women, especially during suffrage movements and the movement for reproductive rights. I think there's this misconception as well that militarization of the police is a recent phenomena, when in reality, the birth of the police really comes out of military models. And so early American policing is taken right from models of American imperialism in occupations of the Philippines and Cuba, Hawaii, and Haiti and Nicaragua, among countless other examples of American occupations. This also, of course, stems from a long history of violent tactics used against, indigenous people within, colonial systems of violence as well. We also have to look at the bigger picture, too, of federal level policing. So that would include the CIA and the DEA and ICE, as previously mentioned, as well as the FBI, which has long used surveillance and disinformation tactics, violence, terrorism, and entrapment in the name of false domestic security. And many of those tactics used explicitly against Black civil rights organizations. So you could look at the FBI's harassment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You could look at the FBI's involvement in the assassination of Fred Hampton. You could look at their targeting of leftist organizations, so suspected, socialists and communists during the Palmer raids. And then more recently, targeting Muslim neighborhoods and communities through a variety of quote unquote domestic terrorism laws that are really just about managing people that don't fit the idea of the ruling class. The important thing to also consider in this is the history of criminality. So policing and criminality go hand in hand because we have to look at criminality as something that's made up by the state. So criminality is not the same as morality. It's not the same as justice. It's rather just a definition of what we describe as quote unquote deviant behavior. So in this system where police are managing that behavior, economic and racial inequalities actually lead to greater levels of policing because the state turns to them rather than addressing issues like education and healthcare and housing, all of those things that we named in our statement up front. The ever-changing application of drug laws is a really good example of this that shows that criminality is both invented and unevenly applied. But we could also look at the history of things like anti-miscegenation laws, anti-sodomy laws, anti-sedition laws that ebb and flow throughout American history and really show that these are about controlling people and not necessarily about creating some moral society or safe society. Uh, the other thing we can look at is the uneven distribution of punishment that goes along with that as well. So we know that a low-level drug offense, for instance, can spiral into a lifetime prison sentence, for instance, but we also know that rich people can now run their own dispensaries and not face any of those things. We also know that, depending on your relationship to the ruling class, you can defraud people, you can poison water supplies, you can poison children, and face little to no accountability. And yet, the working class and the poor continue to face these systems of oppression with the police. We often focus on violence and brutality because I think those are the most shocking to us. But this managing of behavior also includes those nickel and dime day-to-day interactions with the police. So citations, civil forfeitures, the defense of private property, the enforcement of evictions, rules of assembly that are unevenly applied, particularly to homeless people, but also in the past to gay community as well as this looming and ever escalating threat of violence is something we have to think about, where if you belong to any of these groups and you ever do resist, the inevitable consequence is going to be some kind of threat from the state, enforced by the police. Ultimately, I think we have to think about, when we think about social justice movements, one of the key things we often think about is civil disobedience in terms of calling attention to unjust laws and unjust, arrangements of hierarchy. And we have to ask ourselves, who is always there to enforce those unjust laws? Who is always there to terrorize those who protest? No matter what group you're talking about, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's labor organization, whether it's gay rights, all of these things inevitably face the exact same force of people that respond with violence, respond with oppression, respond with brutality. And so when we think about moving towards a more just society, and this is the picture that we see every single time, we have to think about other tactics. And that's why we talk about abolition and defunding. So moving into abolition, one thing that we should talk about is the definition of abolition. So I think we often focus on the stark definition of, getting rid of something. So getting rid of the police entirely. But I think it's important to know, looking at people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and many other abolition movement leaders that talk about abolition as a framework or a model. So it's kind of a new way of thinking rather than thinking about our current punitive justice system. We look at community control and transformative justice. Modern movements to abolish the police emerge from the long history of oppression of Black people in America, with Black Marxists and Black feminists leading the way in the theory and the action. But looking at these other policing events, we have to recognize that unless we belong to the ruling class, this affects all of us. So this is not something that is unique to any community. However severe certain communities experience it, which is certainly true, we are all in this together. So it's important to think about abolition as a way of thinking. So when we speak about defunding or abolition, we're talking about two things that work in tandem. One is the destruction of oppressive systems. So, defunding the police, taking away their resources, abolishing prisons, abolishing oppressive systems. That is one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is the simultaneous construction of a more equitable and just society, one that looks away from these, quote unquote solutions to social conflict and to healthier ones. So while abolition speaks to the immediate need for harm reduction, it also speaks to the longer term project of reimagining society with the goal of transformative justice in mind. Abolition also involves improving social relationships. So capitalism, racism, these things alienate us from each other, which is exactly what the ruling class wants to happen. They don't want us working together. When we are alienated, we are more likely to turn to impersonal forces to resolve conflict and to manage the behavior of others. It's often said that you probably wouldn't call the cops on your friends if they were doing something that was dangerous, but would you do it for your neighbor? Would you do it for a random person on the street? Much more likely to happen, even though you might know in the back of your head what the consequence of that move might be. So abolition has to address the antisocial climate that capitalism and racism purposely foster through the ruling class to create those conflicts, but also to suppress mass movements for justice and equity. Now, some reforms might mitigate the violence of policing in its current format, but we have to think beyond reform, because reform can't be the long-term solution. If the root purpose of the police is as we believe it to be, as speaking from a socialist organization, then there really is no reforming that institution. That institution will always be a barrier to our underlying goals. We can think about prison culture website. Miriam Kaba has a really good list of things to think about. There's probably some quibbles with this list, and I won't go through it, but just to think about, what is it that the reform is supposed to do, and what is it that we're actually trying to change? Those are really important questions to ask. It's also really important to see that a lot of the reforms that we're currently seeing proposed just so happen to be endorsed by the ruling class, which should give you some real pause as to how effective they're actually going to be. Ultimately, what I would say is that policing is designed to protect the ruling class, so capital and the capitalist class, and as such, the police as a system are fundamentally anti-working class and in place to prevent any meaningful movement towards a more equitable and democratic society. So any movement that challenges the ruling class's oppression, whether that's expressed through capitalism or through racism or sexism or ableism or homophobia or Islamophobia or pick your poison, inevitably those movements will face the reactionary force of the police in their struggle. So if our goal, which it is as a democratic socialist organization, is to create a more democratic society, and not just in the voting booth, but at work, at home, and throughout the community, one that values the lives of every person, one in which we emphasize housing and healthcare and education and safety, a just and healthy society. It just can't include our current imagination of the police. And we have to also acknowledge that the police are a major obstacle to those goals. So I'll return to our statement here, just to recap that, the first is that immediate end of violence. The second is reallocating things into resources that we know will help people. And the third is moving to that broader vision that allows us to work in tandem in working class movements across lines of division created by the ruling class to make a more just society. So I will stop it there and pass it back to Quinna to introduce our panelists, and I look forward to the insight and discussion that they bring. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nate. First up, we're going to have Terry Anderson. So Terry Anderson is the Spokane director of the Tenants Union in Washington State.
Okay, hi. Gosh, that was an awesome introduction. It touched on so many areas that I think that we address in housing. So yes, defunding the police is one way to get resources to what I would call upstream resources that prevent the necessity or need or the opportunity for law enforcement to intervene in our private lives, and housing is a human right. And when you see the disparity in housing, it shouldn't really be any surprise that the consequences are the injustice in our criminal justice system. Because if you don't have a home, if you don't have a place to have your home base so that you can get a job, so you can participate in the public education system, where you can take advantage of opportunities that could, create a economic justice without adequate and without a just housing system, that just isn't possible. And so what you see happening is what you could expect to see happening. And I think you folks at the DSA have a pretty good outlook on exactly why and how capitalist forces involved in our entire economic history and in our entire history of the United States includes housing, and why we're where we are. We should flip the amount of money that we spend on law enforcement and the amount of money we spend on affordable housing. It's just, to me, it's criminal that we are not addressing the fact that we have homelessness, that people are now operating outside of even having a roof over their head, and yet you expect this sort of it just seems like such a setup, Hey, the police are right there with the raids. I've been questioning how many people are being arrested simply because they don't have a roof over their head and they have an unjust warrant for their arrest. And then we have police coming in, sweeping people from under bridges and out in their encampments, and who have these unjust warrants and now are jailed for what? For not having a roof over your head. So when you talk about criminalization of behavior, we're criminalizing, bodily functions. We're criminalizing marginalizing existence, and that all works into, oh gee, we need more money to fund the police to enforce all these laws, and we've created where we're at. What we'd like to see, at the tenants union is for housing justice, for us to actually invest in our community instead of jail our communities. I think another thing that I heard the whole list of all the things that law enforcement was created to do in historically. I also would like to add evictions. Evictions have always been conducted by an armed law enforcement agent. And I've questioned, why does it take a sheriff with a gun to execute a warrant when a judge has issued a writ of restitution? Why does it have to be a sheriff? And I'm told, well, that's history. Sheriffs have been involved in evictions from the beginning of time. Well, that doesn't, in my opinion, that doesn't justify it. We did a whole lot of stuff in the history of America that have been abolished and need to be abolished. And so this is just another example of how you combine criminalization with even living in your own home. And there has been gun violence by police. Police you have used gun violence on tenants in evictions. It happened here in Spokane. I believe it was 2016 at the Agnes Kehoe apartments, when the sheriff were executing a writ of restitution on a tenant who'd been evicted. And by the way, that is publicly funded housing, the Agnes Kehoe apartment building, that's funded by our tax credits. And so why they would even be evicting a tenant in publicly funded housing is very questionable to me. And then allowing a sheriff to come in to execute that warrant. Well, the sheriff called the Spokane Police Department when they thought there might be trouble. Well, of course, the Spokane police come at the ready with their guns ready to be drawn, and that's what they did. Think, with their Superman X-ray vision, they saw guns underneath blankets and stuff, so they shot him. Luckily, he lived, but this kind of violence happens in housing. I should talk a little bit about just the racial disparity in housing. I think you did a pretty good job in explaining the racial disparity in the criminalization of Americans, and but the racial disparity in housing is horrible, especially in Spokane. So I'll use Spokane as our great example. In Spokane, 80% of all Black households in the city of Spokane live in rental housing. Over 60% of all Indigenous and people of color live in rental housing, yet only 30% of white households live in rental housing. So when you see housing policies that give a rental security and housing stability and housing security to homeowners, but that same housing security and housing stability is not included in policies for renters, then that's a racial disparity just by nature of who is a renter and who is a homeowner. Only renters can be evicted. So obviously, eviction laws are going to only impact renters, who are 80% of the Black community. We have an eviction moratorium right now that's scheduled to end at the end of June. And we know that those who are most impacted, who will be the most impacted when this moratorium ends, are going to be people of color, because they are also the same communities who were most impacted by COVID. You either lost your job, you left your job because you didn't want your family members to die, you didn't want to do that, or you were laid off. I mean, there were then the very same demographic that are on the downward side of the K side recovery are the same people that are renters. So, and then we have the extra burden in our city, in that all the work at home people living in these crowded cities with high housing costs like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco have found the advantage of working from home and say, well, let's move to a town that has more affordable housing, and they're all moving to Spokane. We have a 0.5 vacancy rate in the city of Spokane. Who does that impact? It impacts the very same people who are impacted by the criminal justice system. So if we spend as much on housing people and getting people into homes and having a stable home situation as we did in law enforcement, maybe we wouldn't need law enforcement. Maybe we wouldn't need jails. Jails are not a substitute for housing. I was at a recent landlord-tenant work group meeting where the landlord, who was a member of that group, actually said, made a comparison that the federal government provided housing to Japanese Americans during World War II. That's not housing, that's internment, that's incarceration. You cannot compare spending money on incarcerating people with spending money on housing people. They are not the same thing. But that's the mentality you get when you hear people talk about publicly funded housing. And so that to me leads right to the conversation of defunding the police, because where's our money going into? Our money right now is going into law enforcement and what I call the homelessness industrial complex. We spend a humongous amount of money in the city of Spokane. Probably, I would say, and Anwar might be a very good person who would know this, but maybe 3/4 of the city budget is spent on law enforcement and homelessness. Those two things. But we're not doing anything to provide housing justice, to help people have a roof over their heads, to help people keep a roof over their heads, to help tenants stay housed even in light of this immediate, weeks away disaster that's coming our way. The Spokane County Eviction Defense Project is estimating 2,500 evictions immediately when the moratorium ends, because that's enough landlords that have done that pre-work that under the pilot project and under the new laws that they will be eligible to evict tenants, 2,500. And after that, a steady pace of 2,000 evictions a month, as far out as the eye can see. And if you guys aren't seeing evictions, you're going to be seeing rent increases. Rent increases are already happening in the city of Spokane. Our office is getting calls from tenants who live in buildings where entire buildings are getting rent increase notices, which, by the way, are illegal. So if anybody out there gets one of these notices that says, come in the office within 2 weeks to sign your new lease, and your new lease, the rent's going to be, and they're always like about $300 more than where they're spending. Those notices are not legal during the moratorium, and you should file a complaint with the Attorney General. We are assisting tenants right now with filing those complaints. So you could call our office and we can help you. And we're actually filing the complaints ourselves too, because we're just so tired of seeing these rent increase notices. Rent increase, anything that even has a number on it shouldn't even be sent to you until after the moratorium is over. And so if you're getting that, that's not legal. But those are the kinds of things that are going to impact the very same people that are impacted by our criminal justice system. So that's what's going to happen is that they will go from having a home, becoming homeless, and going to jail. So yes, please defund the police. Thank you, Spokane DSA, and I probably talked too long. So I'll let the next panelist speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. So we should defund the police and invest in housing for everyone.
Yes.
Okay, up next, we're going to have Onward Peace. Here we go. Human Rights Commissioner and activist.
Good afternoon, all. First, I would like to thank the organizers as well as my fellow panel members for having this important discussion today. So I am a City of Spokane Human Rights Commissioner, although today I am speaking as a 21-year police accountability activist. And so my perspective on defunding is a little nuanced, mainly because I remember when I first started my activism, Um, I used to hear the complaints from officers a lot about how they were being asked to do too much for too little pay. They were being asked to be social workers. They were being asked to be marriage counselors and truant officers. They were being asked to be neighborhood dispute resolutors. And they, with their police union, whined about how many hats they had to have. So it's very interesting that, 20 years on, we're having this discussion about defunding the police, because the very element of what we're talking about is what those officers were griping about. We want to take the money away from the police department so they can focus on actually doing peace officer work on our streets. Instead of having to be the social worker or the truant officer, we want them to focus on catching the bank robbers, which they have a horrendous rate of not catching in this town until after the fact. I heard a recent statistic the other day that police actually only solve about 2% of our crime. So why are we spending so much money on 2%? Wouldn't it make more sense to divert some of that funding? That way we can utilize behavioral health specialists to interact with our vulnerable, mentally ill population in a caring and compassionate way, instead of bringing a gun to a situation where somebody's mentally unstable. That just doesn't make sense. Although I do want to caution the defund element. When we talk about defunding the police, we really have to be cognitive of what we're actually asking them to get rid of. You can't just automatically tell a police department, like over in Seattle, you've got to cut your budget by 50% and think that they're not going to cut things that we want them to keep, like their community outreach programs and all the touchy-feely stuff that we've been working so hard for departments to have in their department. As soon as we mandate 50% cuts, those are the first things that'll go. Other things that'll go will be non-critical functions of the police department, like fingerprint technicians, which you might not think that are so relevant, but how about when your garage is broken into and you want to track down who took all your tools? You need a fingerprint technician to collect those fingerprints, scan those fingerprints, and run those fingerprints for possible hits. They will cut those positions to keep their toys like $300,000 Bearcats, which Spokane has 2 of them. Other toys that they have that I just recently found out, both the Spokane Police Department and the Sheriff's Office have drones. That's right, drones. Now the ACLU has, every time that a police department has brought drones into their arsenal, the ACLU has fought because of privacy rights. What are these officers doing with drones? What is the policy on drones? There is no policy in our police manuals dealing with drones. So what is the privacy issues that they're dealing with? Can these drones be weaponized? All very good questions. And so when we talk about defunding the police, we're also talking about taking away some of these toys. Boys and their toys, I know. But the thing is, they can do their job without it by simply being human beings and showing empathy and compassion in complete police work, instead of being this warrior-based thug mentality that they currently are in. How about showing compassion to that homeless person that you're passing on the street? Asking them when was the last time you had something to eat, and getting them something to eat, instead of going ahead and throwing away all their belongings underneath the bridge. Some compassion instead of their toys would make policing more effective and it would heal the community police relationship so much. So I can go on and on for hours talking about this subject, but the main thing that we as a community here in Spokane have to really get across to our police departments why we want them to change. We here in Spokane are the third deadliest police force in the nation. Third. Places like Chicago and Miami had less officer involved fatalities than we have in, I believe, an 8 years time period. The fact that our police leadership are playing games with people's lives, their little math classes that want to dispute this fact, is absolutely atrocious. And that's why I believe that it's time for the Department of Justice to come into town here and actually solve the actual problem of whether or not the police department's numbers are correct or us as a community's numbers are correct, with the fact that this is the third deadliest police force in the nation, as well as a Black man here, I'm 5 times more likely to get stopped, detained, and arrested than my white counterparts. So when we talk about defunding, these are some of the elements that we're talking about. We're also talking about, hey, when was the last time you got a less than priority one call done under 9 hours? Let's say somebody broke into your garage. How long did it take for this police department to respond? I've heard in some cases it's taken 2 to 3 days for them to respond to that call. What are they doing? Well, they're rushing around to non-priority calls of people jaywalking and intimidating the public, racing around here. Meanwhile, you just want your garage tools back, and it takes you 3 days. Defunding the police will help the police do their job better. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Anwar. Okay, up next, Ava Sharifi. So I'm going to say she is a UW political education graduate and co-founder of Eastern Washington Progressives, or EWAP.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I've really enjoyed so far hearing from Nate and Terry and Anwar. I hope I'm not going to be repeating too much information, just because seriously, it's really great to see like the range of stuff we've already been able to cover today. But again, thanks for having me. So I'm not going to take the time to essentially describe how it is that we reach this point of mass incarceration. I'm really convinced that with the audience we're speaking to today, we already know the history involving law and order politicians, mass funding of prisons and jails, the war on drugs, and of course, systemic racism. So instead, I wanted to take a moment to describe to you how the system has maintained itself, and to go back to this notion that we do not actually have a broken criminal justice system, but instead that it is working exactly as it was intended to, which becomes this self-perpetuating monster, beast, machine, whatever you would like to call it. So talking about the ways in which it maintains itself is important. And then next, I want to talk about if incarceration even works, in which the spoiler alert is that no, it doesn't. But I did want to go over a few examples of the ways in which incarceration does not work, in fact, does not make us safer. And a lot have actually argued that it makes us into a more dangerous society because we are ripping people away from their families and support systems, and throwing them into cages. So, and then lastly, of course, going over reforms like transformative justice reforms. So I first want to go through the arguments that people essentially go through when they say that we need prisons to make us safer. It usually boils down to deterrence, to incapacitation, and justice for victims. They say these 3 things are the reasons why we need prisons. However, incarceration does not deter crime. It does not provide justice for victims. So instead, it fulfills only one goal out of these three, which is incapacitation. And that's because prisons have over and over again proven to be an ineffective tool of intervention. You have to remember that incarceration is a form of punishment that happens after the harm has already occurred, not before. And that incarceration only addresses certain types of harm. People who sell drugs, for example, on the street would risk arrest, right? But the same rarely applies to, let's say, the wealthy people that spawned today's opioid crisis. How about the board members and the corporate executives responsible for oil spills, for completely destroying the environment? Wall Street executives that were able to predict economic crises and said nothing in order to make a profit. These people rarely face handcuffs or jail time. So when we hear the question or the statement that prisons provide safety, we have to ask, safety for who and from what? And, I don't have to explain to DSA that it is oftentimes soothing that sense of fear instilled in white Americans and politicians that we must keep safe. We have to protect ourselves from the poor and people of color. And so this has to do, of course, with systemic classism, with racism, fueled by media outlets that want to make this into a newsworthy, consumable thing as part of capitalism. And to prove that point further, studies have shown that when asking white Americans to estimate crime rates among different races, they consistently overestimate the percentage of crime committed by Blacks and Hispanics as compared to their own race, in which they always underestimate the amount of crime committed by white folk. And so despite the lowered rate of crime in becoming the victim of these stories that happens to white Americans in our country, consistently, they have a more punitive and iron fist approach when it comes to voting for stricter imprisonment and policing mechanisms, especially against communities of color. So when politics and governments are answering to these fears, answering to these votes, these monies, we effectively are wiping out a portion of our population, saying that they, while we actually make fun of them, in essence, to say, all you have to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we make it impossible for them to escape their situation, to actually better themselves. And that's because research has shown, again, that incarceration does not deter crime, nor does it rehabilitate. Instead, it actually increases rates of recidivism. And that sometimes scares people. They get the wrong idea from that. They say, oh no, we're creating even more criminals. That's the ironic part. About 1/3 of the people who are actually committing repeat crimes are going back to prison because of violations of parole, things like missed office appointments, positive drug test results, which is a whole other story involving the war on drugs, and breaches of curfew. So this is not something that, of course, we are not rehabilitating people, but more than anything, we keep on getting people trapped in this cycle over very frivolous violations. So in California, for example, 65% of new admissions into the prison systems are for parole violations. And that right there costs the state $1 billion annually to file these parole violations. And you begin to wonder to yourself, what could be done if this budget were to be redistributed into actual human services? So instead of encouraging people to take responsibility for the harms they've caused, as a lot of times these conservatives, they put down, they say prison is for, you do the crime, you want to do the time. You have to take personal responsibility, but they can't. How can you take responsibility and rehabilitate for harms that have been done onto society if the prison environment is not made for that? It is a place to simply survive and to be isolated. People come out of prison not being able to get a job, not being able to educate themselves, cannot find housing, being completely removed from society. Children are left without a parent. Family members now lose a person who is helping with the bills, the caregiving, the general support of the household. I mean, we are talking about not just one person's individual life becoming ruined, but communities, families being dismantled. And so with all that in mind, we look at the real facts, and the facts tell us that reducing prison populations at this point in time actually seems to be correlated with the reduction in crime. So let's look at some numbers. So let's give us 20 years. So the year 1994, which we know is not a very good year for the war on drugs, increased crime, we have capitalism going crazy. 1994 to 2014, we have about 20-year span here. In those 20 years, New Jersey reduced its prison population by 25%, and reports of violent crime also dropped by 31%. So down, right? California reduced a prison population by 25% in these 20 years, and violent crime again dropped by 21%. Chicago, same thing. Don't want to overwhelm you too much with the numbers. Now, New York City shows a different story. So between 1994 and 2014, 20 years, there is now that dramatic decrease in violence. So just like the other examples, you would think it would mean a decrease in the prison population, but unfortunately that has not been the case. The city continues to add more officers to the police force, and those police officers continue arresting people for very minor violations. And so it bumps up the prison population, but violence hasn't gone up. It's still down here. So what does that mean? Police, for example, in 2018 in New York City made 800 arrests for rape. In contrast, they made over 5,000 arrests for fare evasion. So these arrests don't contribute to public safety. They're punishing people who cannot afford to pay $2.75 for the subway, putting them under arrest, putting them under a fine that is 30 times greater than what they already couldn't afford. And now they're bumping up the prison population, everything else in between. So it's what Anwar was saying. It's when, with the Spokane example, you're having these priorities be on homeless sweeps, being on toys and drones, when in actuality, you think it makes you feel perhaps the white population, the ones who are having this fear, it makes them feel safer to have these people behind bars. But in actuality, I don't think any one of us are really safer from a person who couldn't pay $3 for the bus. And instead, you are now ripping apart their family, their community, and when they have to leave prison, eventually, you are creating a more broken person. And so with that in mind, now to scheme up to go more towards the national level. In 1991, since 1991, sorry. So since that same time frame we're talking about, in 20 years, violent crime has actually fallen more than 51% in the United States. Now, if you're anything like me, I am a sucker for true crime shows. It's a terrible habit. I know I shouldn't be so involved in them, but like Nightline, 2020, anything involving a murder really gets my heart rate going. But that's exactly the reason why the average American wouldn't know that violent crime has fallen by 50% over the past 20 years. It's because of this fueling of scary homicidal stories. They say that in the past 10 years, our three major news networks, them focusing on very specific niche crimes, has gone up by nearly 4 times. So what I mean by niche specific crimes, it's really rare to have crime happen between races, to have crime happen between genders. It typically happens within the community. It doesn't happen between strangers. Even if something involving like a sexual assault, it usually is done by a loved one. Only 20% of them are done by strangers. But all of these news sources would make you feel like the Black and Latino men are out raping white women, that you are going to be mugged on the street randomly. Don't walk through the bad neighborhoods, something might happen. It's these stories that actually fuel and make these statistics way bigger than they really are. And it increases the amount of people behind bars for doing frivolous things, even looking suspicious or loitering, or at times we've seen stories that catcalling a woman on the street. For a person who is a person of color, they're going to be punished much more punitively than a white counterpart for doing the same act. So we are not actually keeping people safer from the actions. We are keeping people safe from our own created fears of who are the bad apples, the dangerous ones in our society. And that has created a completely horrible systemic problem that feeds itself, that's classist, that's racist. So the last part of that equation, so I mentioned three things, right? I said deterrence, incapacitation, and providing justice for victims. So we know it doesn't deter crime. We've just proved that. We know that it obviously incapacitates them. They can't actually go back to their regular life. So the last question becomes, does incarceration provide justice for victims? That's the last piece of this equation. And already off the bat, looking at reality, the argument, it just doesn't fit. Over half of violent crimes in which there could even be a victim, a person buying drugs for themselves, their victim is themselves, we could say. So we talk about violent crimes, right? Another person got injured in this situation. There is a chance of victimhood. Over half of violent crimes go unreported. So we're already at 50%. Fewer than half of those result in an arrest. Then of that half, fewer than half of those arrests result in conviction. So that means that incarceration addresses less than 1/4 of harmful instances in which there could even be a victim. And of that 1/3, many victims, as I mentioned with the sexual assault numbers, with even the murder numbers, many victims come from the same communities and often the same demographics as those who have harmed them. They may not want to see their relatives, their neighbors, their community members locked away. It's actually a question that Nate posed. Would you call the police on your friends if you saw them doing something violent or something wrong versus a stranger, knowing the consequences of what could happen to that person once the police are called and the criminal justice system is now in place? People, a lot of the times who are victims, have said that they just want to have an end to the harm, an acknowledgement, an apology to the harm that was caused, and some kind of effort to ensure that that person will not repeat their harmful actions. But none of those things have been provided to us or will be provided to us, to those victims, through incarceration, especially if they're in a marginalized community or they're harmed by loved ones. There's no way. Beyond giving a chance to do a victim impact statement, incarceration does not provide sustained resources for healing. In contrast, something like restorative justice is a process that involves not only the person who was harmed, but also the people who were indirectly harmed. We're talking family members, neighbors, community members, all coming together to address the harms and the needs and obligations required to begin the process of healing and accountability. In contrast to our current system, in which, guess what? One action, one set of actions will forever define your identity as either the victim or the perpetrator. 20, 30 years can go by and you can still be seen as the crime you committed when you were young, or a lot of times Victims talk about how 5 seconds or 15 minutes of a person raping them now has defined their identity as a victim of that person's touch for the rest of their lives. And that is something that is very difficult to heal from. And so I really enjoyed going back to, actually, Nate made this really interesting point about how abolishment also needs to interact with going against anti-social behavior that is given to us by the capitalistic system that's based in sexism and racism and so many things in between. Restorative and transformative justice, it tries to look at those things through social lenses, community lenses, local lenses, so that we do not have this problem of victimhood, of being forever marked by a red stain from a mistake you made. It needs to have a local lens to it. And my last example I want to give for why it is that victims are not currently being treated well by our current criminal justice system is young Black men. They're more likely to be robbed and victimized by violence, including homicide, than any other demographic. But they're also the least likely to be considered victims by police, by prosecutors, by others in the criminal justice system, the judicial system. They are the people who are most unable to access help and resources to address their traumas and begin to heal. They're the ones that are most often viewed as the criminals, time and again, as the perpetrators of harm. Incidents in which young Black men will come into police departments to report a crime that has happened to them. And strangely enough, they're the ones that end up behind bars because they're not believed. So we have to, again, ask ourselves, when we're trying to provide healing for victims, if that's what they're telling us, who are these victims? It's very slim, and it's certainly not for the poor and certainly not for people of color. And so that begs the question, what can we do to make this better? So a lot of great answers have already been given by Terry, by Anwar, by Nate, about what transformative justice looks like, that it not only needs to involve the community, it not only needs to involve the redirection of funding and money, but it also needs to involve transforming the conditions that generated the harm in the first place, that enabled the harm in the first place. How can you rehabilitate a person if they are not even habilitated in the first place, do not come from an environment in which housing, education, a job, and stability are things that come natural to their life, that can be deemed as privileges? And so that is what we mean when we say defund the police, to try to redirect some portion of the $54 billion that America spends and to put it into human resources and physical infrastructures like schools, healthcare facilities, parks, and public spaces, to rebuild neighborhoods that have been devastated by high levels of incarceration. Time and again, you look at the TV, they will say one question: where do we send these people? We are running out of room. That's not the question. The question should instead become, what can we do to strengthen these neighborhoods to keep their residents out of prison? We need to look at what is underneath the infection, underneath the Band-Aid, instead of trying to constantly just look at the side effects, the symptoms that are coming after. To empower people to respond to harm, conflict, and violence without relying on policing and imprisonment, to make our current institutions places of learning, education, and rehabilitation. And I've been timing myself. I see I have 1 more minute. To not make parole officers second-class police officers, to not reform our criminal justice system, but to shrink it as much as possible. What are a few more that I can give? To decriminalize nonviolent activities that allow police officers to target the poor, the marginalized, the stigmatized, not doing stop and frisk, broken window policy, loitering laws, predictive policing, homeless sweeps, eviction sweeps, no to mental health jails, no youth jails. I could go on, you guys. My point is that there are a long list of things that we have determined as to what could be transformative justice, on top of defunding the police, to also rebuild these communities. But it really takes a multifaceted effort from everyone. It takes redirecting funds and also really approaching this from a social perspective, a community perspective. It cannot be done in isolation. So yeah, thank you for listening to me talk, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ava. I think at one point I'm like sad, but I'm also hopeful. So thank you so much for everybody that spoke today. I think up next, we're just going to see about Q&A. So if you have any questions to ask our panelists, now's the time.
So let's start with, we got a couple of questions in the Q&A portion here. So if you do have questions, by all means, submit them, and then we'll kind of take them one at a time. So one, I think, good question that maybe we can kind of expand to is a discussion of how do you respond to a Blue Lives Matter opinion? So how do you respond to that kind of approach? So this is a common refrain, I think, that cops and supporters thereof tend to think that they're under attack currently in America, and that their lives and jobs are incredibly dangerous at the moment due to these conversations. What would be I see Anwar laughing. I see Ava laughing. So what would be I'll throw this out to whoever wants to answer it. So what would be your response to a question like that?
I often try to do it from two perspectives. One is to try to point out their own hypocrisy, in which oftentimes people who are Blue Lives Matter, they're supposedly supposed to be anti-government, right? They want small government. But ironically enough, they are the biggest toters of guns, of police departments, of over surveillance. So it's to remind them that when we say Black Lives Matter, of course, we are focusing it on a racial issue. But if you want to meet them where they're at, it's to focus it from a surveillance and government position, so they can try to perhaps see if they can come to your side to say that, you know, this is not only to benefit Black and brown people, it's also to benefit you. Do you really like cops being on your front porch? Do you know that the biggest portion of people who are, you know, getting in trouble with the police are poor white folks? And it's not because of race, it's because of population size, and also because of classism, the ruling class. So it's something that we can go from an anti-government, anti-surveillance perspective. And also to go against their idea of like, well, then who are you going to call? They love saying that. To say that this is supposed to be a question for community-based things. Always these people talk about self-defense and things like that. We are trying to look for ways that we can look inward into the community and not be relying on police departments, be doing things in a less violent way. And so we don't have to worry about calling someone right now. That's not the first question. That's my point of view, at least.
I think what I would say from our point of view is that there are areas that the police don't need to be involved in, and it may be better served to have social workers and people from areas of expertise. And so when I talk about the housing issue, why is a sheriff with a gun evicting people? Why doesn't somebody go there with resources, the ability to relocate them? Why don't we spend money on housing so people aren't being evicted? Or if they are being evicted, there's a place for them to move to so they don't end up on the streets because we haven't put enough investment in public housing. You know, I think that if we actually invested in our communities, I think that we would make life better for law enforcement, because if everybody had a roof over their head, had a quality of life, I think that they would see that there would be less need and necessity and less people calling them. But yet we instead focus on spending money on you know, again, like what the speaker said about providing this false sense of safety, and we kind of spend money on this false notion rather than addressing the real need in our community. And so I think that if we defunded the police, we'd be helping them.
So, so first of all, like the whole issue of Blue Lives Matter, like that's not really a thing. There is no such thing as blue life. At the end of the day, they get to take that blue uniform off. Unfortunately, I don't get to do that with this. So when we talk about Blue Lives Matter, folks, that's the first thing. Second of all, if these Blue Lives Matter people actually cared about police, these Blue Lives Matter people would make sure that our police officers have, the police officers and their families have the proper resources to domestic violence resources, because domestic violence rates in police officers' home is 6 times higher than the national standard. If these Blue Lives Matter folks actually cared about police, they would institute random drug and psychological testing for officers to make sure that they're handling their stresses correctly. Every year, officer involved or line of duty deaths of officers nationally are, I think this past year was, I think it was like 258 officers died. That same number of officers that died in the line of duty, that same number committed suicide. 2 of those officers were Capitol police officers after the insurrection. So if these Blue Lives Matter folks actually cared about our police, they'd be focusing their attention on the police instead of coming after activists and other entities that are trying to create positive changes in our community. What are Blue Lives Matter folks doing? Having little rallies at coffee shops? When was the last time that they took the time to go to a community meeting and actually actively participate in the community dialogue or discussion without coming at us with some kind of hero worship because they wanted to be cops at one time and were rejected? I appreciate the Blue Lives Matter folks because they're human beings, right? But they're human beings that are dead wrong and on the opposite side of justice and equality for us all.
Great answers. Thanks for everyone for answering that. I would also add too that just to kind of add on to some of those statistics, some of the responses from the Blue Lives Matter crowd talk about how dangerous it is to be a cop, but that's often completely inflated. It's not even in the top 10, not even in the top 20, I don't think, in terms of most dangerous jobs. And as Anwar was pointing out, a lot of the actual incidents that take place have nothing to do with what Blue Lives Matter crowd would think of as dangerous policing. It has to do with entirely other events going on in their lives. And then the other thing I would also add, if you're talking to someone, is to kind of reiterate that, at least from this perspective, that the police are an institution. So when we're talking about whether it's reform, whether it's defund, whether it's abolishing, we're not talking about your uncle who's a cop. We're not talking about your friend who's a cop as an individual. We're talking about the purpose of this institution and what it should be doing, or if you don't think it should be doing anything and it should be replaced with a different service. And so I think a lot of these arguments tend to become personalized when they shouldn't be, or they're personalized in a way that completely depersonalizes the victims thereof of police violence or police oppression. So let's move on to another question. So we'll go with Will's question here, which is what can be said about the sheriff's departments across the U.S. collaborating with Border Patrol and ICE? Particularly Spokane has a history of collaborating with said agencies, especially with the bus terminal and other locations. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I feel bad for speaking first again, like I had on the last question. I'm so sorry. I got a chance to actually work on the Spokane Border Patrol case and get some personal experience with this. Despite, not having the personal experience of like being stopped by police, let's say like at like a traffic stop, I did have a Border Patrol experience at the Spokane terminal where getting asked over and over again if I was actually born here, if I can show my driver's license, if I can show some kind of second ID to prove that I didn't fake my ID. So point being is like, I get it. It sucks. It's terrible. And it's something that I'm really happy that the Attorney General got to actually work a little bit on. And I believe at this point in time, there is some more strict rules around Border Patrol agents being able to actually operate within the Spokane terminal. But as with everything that is legal, they have found loopholes. So if the Attorney General says you can no longer park yourself inside of the Spokane terminal, no worries, everyone. The Border Patrol will just park themselves in the parking lot of the Spokane terminal. So yeah, we're a lot safer now. Thank you. So that's terrible. And I really hope we can continue to work on that issue. Now, speaking nationally, the one point I wanted to make is that it's actually been a lot more common ever since this conversation of mass incarceration has become more nationalized and people are becoming more aware of these problems. You may have noticed we've had a lot more movements against private prisons, against trying to divest away from those things. But unfortunately, even though states like California and a lot of our other liberal states have divested away from private prisons, these private prisons have now become the new immigration centers. And so we have about, before we used to have like, let's say half of private prisons doing stuff. Now 73% of private prisons are just doing immigration detention, and they're under a completely different realm of laws. That's what's going on for state governments, that the state prisons, I mean. And so it is horrendous and a completely legal loophole, in my opinion, of sheriff departments collaborating with private prisons and Border Patrol and ICE, because they can consider themselves different departments and private institutions, and it's a civil issue, not a criminal issue, and hiding themselves under so many layers of legality that they've been able to actually make an almost more abusive system, but because it's less supervised, an even more abusive system towards people who don't even have a charge on them, no criminal charge on them yet, than even our state prisons. So I just want to throw that one out there.
Hi, I don't have a whole lot of experience with ICE, but the one thing that has struck me, especially in Spokane, where our where our bus terminal station is considered within the boundary of the Border Patrol, the very same, again, I'm going to get back to that, the very same people who are more likely to access the Greyhound bus for transportation are people who rent. And it also gets, especially in Eastern Washington, where there's a lot of travel between Central Washington and Eastern Washington, again, you're going to get a disproportionality of folks who are Latinx. And those rates are absolutely targeted racially. They don't ask absolutely everybody on the bus for their papers, but they do target who they ask. And they're more than likely renters. And again, this gets back to the whole other point of when renters are arrested, and with our current bail system, when you are taken away from your home, you can't pay your rent. Your landlord then considers your property abandoned. You get evicted, you lose your home, you have nowhere to come back to. When you're finally ready to try to get a start, you have to start from dirt because you don't even have a home and a roof over your head, and oftentimes your property has been confiscated. So this is what renters have to deal with when they are faced these very same situations that a homeowner would not have to face. So there's the intersectionality in everything that we do, but I always remind people the intersectionality of a renter, it really is over impacted for all of these things because it impacts where you live, whether you have a home. And that's why the overreach by law enforcement affects renters more than homeowners.
So I'll touch on the subject of the sheriff and his collaboration with federal agencies. This sheriff's office here in Spokane collaborates extensively with the DEA, the ATF, as well as the marshals. And they collaborate in a entity known as the Fugitive Task Force. And this task force recently, nationally, has been responsible for a couple high-profile officer-involved fatalities. And so the collaboration of how this sheriff works with our federal entities like Border Patrol and other said federal agencies is kind of troublesome, especially after last year's George Floyd uprising that took place in Spokane. one of the things that we found out as a result of it, now, mind you, we still haven't had an after action report of what happened that day and the police abuse that took place that day. But regardless, a little known senator named Senator Harris, they happen to be vice president right now, did a Freedom of Information request on the Department of Homeland Security. And Senator Harris was asking basically what police agencies have reached out to Homeland Security for assistance during these protests. And guess what? Both the Spokane Police Department and the Sheriff's Office, before our protests even took place, was requesting aerial support from Homeland Security, as well as boots on the ground from them as well, and other equipment from Homeland Security. So I'm very curious to see the after action report of what other police aid entities were in town here. We know in Portland that elements of the FBI SWAT team was brought in to deal with crowd control. So the question is, how much collaboration took place and has continued to take place? And just as a sidebar, speaking of the sheriff, God bless his heart. Just God bless him. He makes my job easier, pointing out the deficiencies in his ability to be a leader in our department in a time that we need him to be. The fact that he's spending all of his time coming after activists, as I'm sure members of this organization know, this sheriff has a real soft spot for us activists. So God bless him. Let him continue talking out the side of his mouth, and I will continue using his quotes to embarrass him. Thank you.
You know, there's a story that's told about the civil rights movement, particularly with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were organizing a protest, and they were talking about where to stage it to protest, and they talked about two locations, one in New York and one in the South, and the main question they asked was, well, what does the cop look like what does the sheriff look like in New York versus what does the sheriff look like down here? Is it a Bull Connor type in New York? And they say, oh no, like he'll probably just round people up, arrest them, and take them off. And they go, well, we're not gonna go there then, because that was beside the point of the protest. We want to go directly to the people that are going to, you know, react the way that we know they're going to react, and you know, show the greatest disparity in terms of these oppressive acts. So I think there's something to be said about having a great sheriff to bounce ideas off of in this climate. So I'm going to combine a few questions because we have a lot of like similar themed. So these are all themed along the lines of what do you see the steps to moving from where we are to something that looks a little bit more humane, to something that looks like reallocating resources. So some of the focused parts of that question involve a question for you, Ava, talking about restorative justice processes. So what do those look like? Are they in place anywhere? Another question from Tyler was about here in Spokane. So what are some opportunities of, you know, moving funding from the police to certain community organizations or to different partners across the community, and then, you know, just sort of a general question of what does your ideal transition look like from where we are now to something that looks a little bit more like what we would hope to see. So lots of different ways to take that question. I think, Anwar, if you could talk about Spokane. Terry, I think you also probably have some good ideas as far as those community groups, and then Ava maybe taking the part about restorative justice in general, whichever order people want to tackle that.
Am I on? Oh, well, you know what? I'll start just a little bit because right now the city of Spokane is going through a housing crisis. I think it's been going on for probably at least 8 years since the tenants union's been in Spokane, but I think the city leaders are now starting to recognize we have a housing crisis. I think that there's been a great movement, at least, a year ago, and it's been slow, but I think initially when the protests were through the city of Spokane, there was a quick reaction by the city to want to listen to the community about the ways that we could fund the police. And so from our perspective, looking at the fact that the city is declaring a housing emergency, which is what we are in, what does that mean with how you're going to allocate the funds of the city? You can't just say, well, we're in a housing crisis, we're in a housing state of emergency, if we aren't going to do something about it. We are actually in the process and talks of talking about how we defund the police and how we reallocate city funds. All it takes is a quick look at the budget to see how much the city of Spokane spends on law enforcement. And I think that the time is really good now, as the city is starting to really address the housing crisis, to say, well, put your money where your mouth is. And if they say, well, where does that money come from? Oh, gee, look at this huge pot in our budget that could easily be reallocated to address some of these concerns. So I think that is happening now. I think contacting your council member, contacting the mayor's office, there are at least 3 or 4 different housing groups being formed right now, by city council, by the mayor, by the city. Find out about them, apply for them. I'm on many of them, and what's lacking are voices of the people. There are people who are the developers who are, stand to make a profit. There are nonprofit advocates who are also working to address the consequences. And we kind of stand alone at the tenants union to try to fight policies that are going to create the injustice to begin with. So I think more voices at the city level right now could have an impact. So I'm hoping that we make changes, because it's very, very scary in terms of housing in Spokane right now.
So as far as what are the next steps, I'm not exactly sure, because unlike other jurisdictions nationally, the police leadership here does not want to even have a discussion about defunding. And so because of that, our city leadership is also not willing to cut the budget or transfer funds at this point, mainly because of the fact that the momentum from last summer kind of slipped away, and the city has intentionally stalled the process of the community roundtable discussions, where the whole element of the community asks for how to perform this department were supposed to take place. The one and only meeting, roundtable meeting, happened May 18th. And when I asked the police chief Thursday when the next meeting was, he said he has no idea. It's not a priority. It's not a priority for city leadership or the police chief. But entities like SCAR and the NAACP and myself, we all view police reform as a priority. So that's first and foremost. Second of all, I think that the defunding debate, as far as it goes for the Spokane Police Department, is going to become very evident very quickly, because a lot of the department's asked recently for city council is direct funding for vehicles. One of the reasons why they're asking for so much money for vehicles is because the vehicle fleet is dilapidated. National best standard for squad cars say that you have to retire a squad car at 85,000 miles, right? And then when you also count in the fact that a national study indicates that for police cars during their idle time, during their time in service, that idle time, you have to equate about 25,000 miles of just idle time. And so when you have police vehicles, which we have at least 45, what the department calls hot seat cars, that are well past the 100,000 mile mark, which they're dilapidated vehicles, pretty soon this department's just going to be on foot beats because they're going to run out of squad cars, and the city council is not going to pass any more money for them until they actually come up with some kind of itemized list of what kind of toys they have. See, this is the interesting thing. Under this police chief and the former mayor, they went ahead and decided that they were going to utilize a city loan that was specifically set up for the police department to add increased squad vehicles throughout the past 5 years, I believe it was. And instead of buying the police cars, they have been buying police equipment. So we were supposed to have a net of a positive net of 13 squad cars this year. I believe we got 6. And they've been pilfering out of that fund dedicated for squad cars to buy more toys. So the city council already knows that this is a problem. And so the past times that the police department's been asking, hey, can we get more money? The city council's like, no, we want to know what you've been spending the money on. So whether or not the department is willingly going to defund themselves, or if we are, either way, it's going to happen, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, and just to add something really quick that addresses more, I think it was Joan's question perhaps, about restorative justice in the past. So I think the criminal justice system being the interlocked like Medusa monster hydra that it is, that takes so many different parts of housing, education, even food security, things like that, in order to actually reduce the amount of people that are going to prison. I think a lot of times the first step when it comes to moving towards abolishment and defunding the police is just trying to go for more of perhaps like social programs, like doing things. Let me pull up my list again. I had put together a little something. Being able to, for right now, not build anything new. That can be a really good place. You know, sometimes it's been a lot harder to convince police departments to cut the budget, but it's been easier to stop one contract of a new prison being built. And so sometimes starting there is a good place. Stopping the building of new places, trying to expand on educational programs that are currently in jail, trying to say that we have to reduce the sentencing laws. A lot of the laws that we have, there is a myth that it is based mostly out of the war on drugs, and it's based on non-violent things, but really there are so many mandatory sentencing laws and other restrictions that are put on judges and other people in the legal system that it makes it so it's just kind of impossible to even figure out who needs rehabilitation, who is just there because they couldn't pay the price to go to trial and to not enter themselves into a plea deal. And, you know, doing other things like trying to remove the question about conviction history within job applications, allowing people to get food stamps and federal welfare, even if they have a felony conviction. And so on and so forth. I hope those are just a few examples, but I know sometimes being like, let's defund the police and tear down the police departments, it feels really scary. So sometimes thinking about it in a little bit smaller steps can be feel a little bit simpler. And they're all part of our pathway towards abolition. Although any one thing put together is too small, but doing them one after the other will hopefully lead us towards the right path. In terms of an example of what's happened for restorative justice, they did this pilot program in Chicago that was only supposed to be for youth prisons. And essentially the people who were in youth prisons, they had the option that instead of doing something like parole, they could get themselves involved in a program, and it's a pilot program, so it was a test, to talk to the victim and the family in which they hurt, and to do this back and forth process that we see a lot in New Zealand, or we see in more indigenous cultures when we keep on bringing up this word of restorative justice, bringing the community, things like that. And it actually showed that the kids who chose to be part of the pilot program versus the kids who said, I'm just going to do the time and get it over with, I don't want to spend 6 more months just talking about my feelings. Those kids who did the pilot program had almost half the rate of recidivism as the youth that didn't. And it's because they really were saying that they could see the impact of what they were up to in a lot deeper of a way. And they actually felt forgiven, and feeling like you're a forgiven person helps the psychological impact of feeling like able enough, capable enough, a person enough to want to contribute to something positive in society. If you feel like a smudge on society, why would you expect them to want to contribute positively? So those pilot programs really worked out, and they've continued to be doing them for youth prisons and youth programs, just because it's a little bit easier to market it and advertise it, saying these kids have a long time to think about their consequences. If only these restorative programs could be given more to adults, that would be really wonderful. But those are some examples, I hope, Joan, that helps of some restorative justice processes that have happened before in the past, that bring in community members, and it's not so legalistic and punitive and violent in some ways, but in like not in a legal violent way. You know what I mean? So yeah, there have been some examples of it in the past.
So we just got a new question from Nick here, talking about what he calls the military to police pipeline, which we know there's a number of ex-military folks that go into police work, as well as not just people, but ideas as well, kind of cross that line. Maybe this is a broader question about steps along the way of alternative programming. So there is a big draw to go into the military economically. It's often a reason that most people enlist, honestly. And so there are these other maybe diversionary programs that we could talk about that are economic in basis, or housing, or education, that allow people to go a different path and maybe not follow that same pipeline. I would say, in the same way we can talk about the school to prison pipeline, there, it's a lack of opportunity, it's a lack of money, it's a lack of resources that we could otherwise be doing. So Nick's question, though, specifically about the police to military pipeline, he asked, doesn't it also create more vicious cops? I would ask, yes, I would say yes to that question. But does anyone on the panel have any thoughts about police departments' incentives for hiring ex-military, what that pipeline looks like? Are there ways that we can halt it? Any thoughts?
I'm sorry, this is Terry. The only thing that comes to my mind in terms of the militarization of police that has me seriously concerned is that I don't think people realize that downtown cores are also neighborhoods, and renters live in those neighborhoods. And when tear gas is set off in your neighborhood, I doubt that any of those police officers worry every day that they're going to have to go home and have tear gas in front between themselves and their front door. And so they need to consider that, and I wonder if that military mentality enters into that strategy, and a disregard of the human lives that actually live in the areas that they want to consider war zones. So that's a big concern of ours here.
So I kind of have mixed feelings about military and the police. mainly, I see it like it might be a benefit of having military experience, especially if the individual was in theater. Mainly because our military have specific rules of engagement, right? Uh, our military don't shoot at people because they fear that there might be possible a weapon. The military is trained to, when they see a weapon being actively used on them, that's when they shoot, unlike police training. So I know a lot of officers that do have military backgrounds, and so it's kind of a mixed bag. Uh, the incentive base that departments use to get uh, military personnel is a little troubling, especially when you look at the lateral hiring process that takes place in departments where a person will be a military member, join a police department, and then for whatever reason transfer from that original department to another department. The majority of our officers here in Spokane are lateral officers, and a good percentage of those lateral hires also have military experience. And so, you know, it is kind of troubling. I know that here locally, there is I can't remember the name of the training facility, but there's a training facility here locally that police officers go to on their off time, where they get into Humvees and pretend like the bad guys are chasing them, and they're shooting backwards out of vehicles, open vehicles. And so the Wild West kind of training philosophy is kind of troubling, because there's no police tactic that there'd be a bad guy chasing you that you would have to fire backwards. I mean, why? So the element of militarization, the element of military personnel being in the ranks is also troubling. And also the other element that's troubling in our police departments is the fact that they really want to view themselves as an occupying army. They're buying these militaristic toys. I was behind a SWAT car the other day. They're in the typical place where a shotgun is at, in the middle of the seat, was replaced by an AR-15 with a suppressor on it. Patrol officer. That's what he's got there. Now, they'll say that they want the suppressors there because firing weapons is dangerous to officers' hearing. Well, guess what? Those AR-15 bullets, they're not like a regular service weapon Glock bullet. AR-15 bullets are meant to go into your body and terminally disrupt organs inside of you. A Glock round is meant to go through. It hurts, yes, you're shot, but it's not creating a whole bunch of havoc inside of your body cavity, which an AR-15 is. So the element of the occupying force, whether you see it or not, those are all in our patrol cars that they have. They've got tactical shields in there. They've got a militarized OC spray. They've got militarized batons that are longer, right, batons than we typically see officers have. There's so much of the militarized industrial complex that's been ingrained in our police departments. And so it's really time that we really think about, instead of an occupying force, maybe we start having the Peace Corps type policing instead.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Those were really great answers from Terry and Anwar. All I might say is that hopefully we can get to a point. I can imagine that these laws were put into place because the police training is so similar to military training that it saves these police departments a lot of money in order to just get people from, coming out of the military. And that right on its surface is problematic. The fact that police training and military training are already so similar that it just saves money to adopt one into the other. When the streets of Spokane, the streets of any community should not be already viewed as a war zone. People should be viewed as civilians, not as some kind of combatants. They're completely different situations, and yet the culture overlaps so much so that sometimes it's difficult to meet a person from that realm of politics who, for example, like doesn't support the military but likes the police, or vice versa. It's either both or neither, it seems. That's problematic. They should not be so clumped together. The second thing I think really quick is that the military, from what I've just seen, so this might not even be like realistic, but from what I've seen is that a lot of times the biggest problems that young men, because I know that Joan and Nick's question was about young people going into the military. It seems like young people, when they go into the military at first, because it's a very transitionary life, it's okay. But because of the nature of them moving around every 4 years or so, it makes it really difficult for them to actually settle down, which is why their version of retirement or their version of settling down is going to their local police department and just becoming a policemen, so they can actually keep their family and do whatever they'd like to do in terms of becoming an adult, getting older within one city versus moving from place to place. And so perhaps there needs to be a different conversation about ways in which we can make people who are signing up to be part of the military more stable, so that we don't have this constant overlapping between police forces and military. Just an idea, though. I'm not really sure how backed up it is by science. So.
So we do have 2 more questions in here. I want to be respectful to time, so I think we are going to try and end it at 3. One is sort of a follow-up question, so I'll start with that, and then I'll move to Jones that's still in the Q&A. So Tyler asks, I think, kind of a direct path question here from the last conversation, which is, how does a failure to critique the U.S. military and its occupations around the world make it more difficult to critique the way that the police act as an occupying force? And so I think we do see a lot of these comparisons. There's also, I would say, there's kind of the propaganda of the veteran who comes back and says, I would never use my gun in Iraq like this. I would only do it, this way. And it's like, well, also you probably shouldn't have been in Iraq either, but how does that translate to these broader systemic critiques that we have of the police if we can't also apply them to the military abroad?
Most certainly, I think a lot of this has to do with psychological aspects. The US is deemed very proudly as the as the global police officer. And psychologically, it does a lot onto a society's perception about what the police is good for. The police, as I believe it was Anwar who said in his very first speech, the police themselves are tired about wearing every single hat. And the reason why they are expected to wear every single hat is because they're more than just a police officer. They're now the morality police. They get to deem what norms and what things are good and bad, which is why we even are praising situations from all the way overseas of US military men saving brown women from brown men. And that is supposed to be their heroism, And it's exactly that kind of psychological belief, whether you want to call it us versus them, whether you want to call it white man's burden, what have you, is the same kind of psychological effect that is occurring on a smaller scale within our own country, in which a lot of times, even the idea of community policing, it got co-opted into this idea that police officers just need to stay in the neighborhood in which they're patrolling for a lot longer, to essentially become more than just policing of laws, but to also become this normative morality white police, Why are they acting a certain way, having their hair a certain way, their pants a certain way? We're going past questions of legality, of safety, of violence, of crime. We're now going to questions of socialization, of culture, of racism, how we interpret perceptions or biases, implicit or not implicit. And all of these things really can come together with how we perceive the US's role in the global system, capitalistic, globalistic, or otherwise. We are the determiners of morality, of norms, of culture, of goodness and badness. And the same thing will go for our people of color and our poor people in America. They better learn, and that's problematic.
So for me, with the last name piece, I've obviously been very anti-war, anti-military all my life. And one of the quotes that has always stuck with me when we're talking about the use of military overseas, Muhammad Ali had a famous quote when he got inducted in the draft. And he said something to the effect of, no Viet Cong ever called me nigger. Why should I go over there and fight for you when you won't even fight for me over here? You're my oppressor. So the aspect of us dictating to others around overseas about what the moral compass is, whether or not Saddam Hussein is a good leader or a bad leader, isn't really our business or responsibility unless war crimes are taking place. And so the aspect that we've been in these silly wars for sadly, I know individuals who are, 20 something years old, and all they've known is the United States being in Afghanistan. The fact that we try to have moral compass in this country as being right and wrong, yet we can't figure out how to create a national reform effort that takes place before George Floyd's anniversary is kind of silly. And people are looking at us. The United Nations on multiple occasions have raised serious issues of American policing. And yet there's no State Department plan on how to address policing in America, even though these international folks are saying that you guys have a severe problem with your police departments. And so maybe instead of focusing on dropping $1 million bombs on people that live on less than 3 cents a day, how about you invest that on fixing the ills that this country has? And so the aspect of us being the peacekeepers it's a myth, because we're actual warmongers, and it's time that we address that.
So I think we will end with this last question, unless there are any quick ones that come in after this. But this is also another question that maybe asks us to think a little bit broader. So it is connected to the police. This is Joan's question in the Q&A there, where Joan asks, she says, there's a growing movement against joint terrorism task forces, and groups like the Brennan Center for Justice are looking at how these lead to profiling and surveillance of communities of color and immigrants and refugees, Muslims and activists, by bringing together the FBI, Homeland Security, and local police into local teams. And she leads this into asking a question about thoughts on abolishing or defunding the FBI. One thing I would add that has become, I think, more prevalent in the news recently is how many instances of the FBI are taking place where they are more or less entrapping young alienated boys, really not men, but boys, into essentially going through with terrorist acts or planning them with the essential like pushing by the FBI. So the FBI is planting these ideas, they're coaxing the boys to act on them or to message about them, and then arresting them. And so there are, in my presentation, I talked about entrapment because that's happening all the time in terms of really targeting vulnerable people and more or less trying to lead them to violence and then arresting them and using that as justification for some of the things that they're doing. And so I do want to talk about that as just this illegitimacy behind some of these movements. So I don't know. There's a lot of other connections there. So I don't know where you might want to take it, but if the panel has any thoughts about the FBI in relation to this conversation.
So I'll just say, the FBI, for a very long period of time, was helmed by one individual. That individual made it a point on keeping secret files on famous individuals and using that as leverage. So the aspect of the G-men and whether or not it should be abolished, the whole inception of it was corrupt. And so the only FBI agent that I like is Fox Mulder.
I perhaps can't get too specific, but I do want to say that, the FBI and police departments around, whether it be state or locally, they're all, in essence, part of the same system in a lot of ways, especially with how our financing works in our country, that a lot of times it's pretty difficult to separate what like state prisons are doing or state departments are doing from the federal bureau. So with that in mind, I'm not sure exactly about the best way to untangle these two from one another, except to say that we should not support any kind of surveillance state as part of the defund the police movement, as part of trying to dismantle systemic racism and mass incarceration that also includes systems of surveillance. 100%. And that can be something that will hopefully be a little bit more cross-political, just because from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of people, when you can talk to them the right way, they get more freaked out about the government spying on them than what's happening right next door, which I wish it was the other way around, but that's where we're at right now. So the system, so surveillance systems are really important to not fall into the trap of, like, for example, there has been pitched ideas of, instead of having prisons, having like the FBI and other bureaus create almost like an open air prison within the United States, where people would just all have ankle monitors and have their GPS monitored 24/7, and there wouldn't be any prisons anymore. But guess what? Now you've made the entire United States into one big prison. I don't think those people's lives would be getting any much better, really, if they still are having such a restriction on their freedoms and what they can and cannot do. So be careful, is maybe my only advice that I have about transitioning a system of isolation and engagement into a system of an open air prison, which is essentially just all surveillance. So be careful of falling into those traps is all I have to say.
I would just add too that there have been more news reports coming out over the last month or so as Congress is trying to reckon with the Capitol riots and what happened in January. And one of the responses is, in fact, to potentially hand over even more surveillance power to the state in terms of in terms of monitoring social media or monitoring phone conversations or texts. And that is one kind of tricky area where we sit on the left, is that this is just this is a policing carceral response to something that needs to have a different response. And so we also have to be kind of aware that while white supremacy and while all of these things are certainly threats in the U.S., by handing over more power to the police, we aren't necessarily solving these things, because it tends to be that when we expand the surveillance state, that surveillance state is used against people of color. It's used against Muslims. It's used against populations that aren't what we would think of as the target, I guess. So other things to think about in terms of the role of the FBI. Quinna, do you want to wrap us up? And thanks for everyone for the great conversation.
Yes, I just want to thank our panelists, Ava, Anwar, Terry. This was an amazing discussion, so thank you for being a part of this. I think we will be sending out something for each of your groups and our group, Spokane DSA, if you want to get involved or if you want to continue the conversation. But thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been a great discussion.
Mhm.